After the storm, in the hush of an ordinary day, can broken souls truly find peace, or does healing have its own silence? On a frozen night, when even hope seemed lost, a weary officer followed a trail of blood through the snow, never expecting the lives that would collide at a stranger's door. A silent child, a loyal German shepherd, and a nurse with her own haunted past. Each brought together by chance, held together by kindness, and tested by a storm that demanded everything they had left. Before the sun would rise, hearts would be broken, secrets revealed, and the smallest gestures would become the difference between giving up and coming home. The night fell heavy on the little town of Cedar Crossing, laying a hush over the frozen river that split the valley in two. Snow had been falling since early afternoon, thick and determined, covering the world in white silence. Street lamps along the riverbank flickered against the wind, their glow swallowed by flurries, reaching only as far as the nearest branch. Jack Harlan sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, engine idling low, heat barely warming the air inside. His hands rested on the steering wheel, knuckles pale where old scars cut across skin. He watched the snow tumble through the headlights, moving in slow currents, each flake tracing its own uncertain path. The radio sputtered with static, a voice from dispatch repeating the report for the third time. Shots fired, a dark sedan last seen turning off the main road, heading toward the water. He pulled his coat tighter, feeling the weight of it settle over his shoulders. Years of restless nights had carved hollows beneath his eyes. His breath formed clouds in the cold, and for a long moment he stayed still, letting the quiet wrap around him. Out here, the world held its breath. Somewhere behind the sound of the river, a branch snapped, a clean, sharp note in the dark. He blinked, as if surfacing from a dream. Jack stepped out into the storm. The snow came up to his boots, each step a muted crunch. He paused at the edge of the woods, where the trees leaned in, their bare arms twisted with frost. The air carried the sharp, metallic scent of something recent, a trace of fear, maybe, or the memory of gunpowder. Light from his flashlight danced across the snow, catching tracks. Half a dozen hurried footprints, a trail of something darker smeared across the surface, already half buried by the storm. He knelt, gloved hand hovering above the marks, not touching. The red was fresh, warm enough to steam in the frigid air, and thin as a ribbon winding toward the trees. He followed, boots sinking deeper as he moved. The wind picked up, needling through the fabric of his uniform, slipping beneath the collar to find the skin of his neck. The only sounds were the hiss of snow, the quiet ache in his knees, and the distant rush of water below the bank. It had been a long time since Jack had felt afraid, but tonight there was something uneasy in the way the world seemed to be holding itself apart, as if waiting for him to decide what would break the silence next. His breath came in small clouds. He paused to steady himself, pressing 2 fingers to his temple, feeling for the old pulse of worry that never quite left. The memories waited, faces, voices, words unspoken. He let them pass through him, like wind, and then returned to the task before him. Ahead, the light caught the edge of metal, a car door wedged against a drift, half buried in white. He circled it, careful, eyes searching for signs of movement, of life. Nothing. The driver's seat was empty, glass broken. The snow inside was stained, but cooling fast. No sign of anyone left. Jack let the beam of his light wander, finding more tracks, a stagger, a drag, the shuffle of feet. The trail curved toward the river's edge, where the ice gathered in thick plates, moonlight glinting on water that refused to freeze. He looked up, watching the sky, the clouds rolling low, and wondered, not for the first time, what it was that kept pulling him out here, night after night, when there was nothing waiting for him at home but silence and the dim blue light of the television flickering over an empty table. Another gust of wind drove snow sideways, stinging his cheeks. Jack pushed onward, body moving more from habit than will. His breath caught in his chest. Sometimes, he remembered, you could hear the river singing under the ice. He listened now, but heard only his own footsteps, and the faint, irregular sound of something not far ahead. Maybe a cough, maybe a word lost to the storm. He crouched low, the flashlight flickering as the battery threatened to die. He saw the trail growing heavier, the blood brighter against the snow, almost luminous. Each print told its own story, a heel slipping, a hand pressed into the drift, the weight of someone who had not given up, not yet. Jack stopped, breath thick in his throat. He looked back the way he had come, the way already disappearing beneath new snow. Ahead, the world was blank, save for the faintest imprint of hope, of something struggling to make its way forward. He tightened his grip on the light and continued, boots moving slower now, each step more careful, less certain. His mind drifted to old arguments, to slammed doors and shouted words, to the echo of voices that never quite faded. He wondered if, in the end, all that remained of a life were the footprints left in the snow, and the memory of who had tried to follow. A howl rose up behind him, not wolf nor wind, but something in between. A note of longing, maybe, or warning. Jack paused, turned his head. For a moment, the woods were nothing but darkness and moving air, the snow thick as smoke. He waited, listening, letting the world settle. The sound came again, softer, farther away, and then was gone. He pressed on, drawn by the only thing that made sense. A trail in the white. A promise. A reason to keep moving. In the night, on the riverbank, with nothing but snow and blood for company, Jack Harlan walked into the heart of the storm. The forest pressed in tighter the farther Jack moved from the riverbank. Snow muffled even the smallest sound, but for a few yards, he could hear the slow beat of his own heart, echoing in the hollows behind his ribs. Each step grew heavier, his boots dragging through white that seemed to have no end, the trail before him narrowing to little more than a series of stumbles and smears. The cold worked its way past his uniform and beneath his skin, sharp as memory. He followed the line of crimson, now scattered with ragged footprints, as it twisted through a grove of bare aspen. Their silver bark caught what little light the night offered, a pale assembly of witnesses. Above, the wind bent the branches, but nothing else moved. Jack paused, letting his eyes adjust, letting his breath quiet so he could listen again. Sometimes in the city, it was noise that haunted him, shouts in the night, the slam of a door, voices rising and falling. Out here it was the silence that made the air feel thin. A dark shape appeared, crumpled where the tracks grew dense, almost missed in the drift. Jack slowed, the light from his nearly dying flashlight wavering as his fingers trembled. At first it seemed a heap of coats, discarded and forgotten, until he saw the angle of a hand, knuckles raw and knotted with effort, as if the last act of will was to hold on to the earth itself. He knelt, breath clouding, and saw a man. Maybe mid-40s, his hair gone silver at the temples, face set in a grimace, mouth parted as if caught in the middle of a word. The man's coat was pulled open, his shirt dark with blood from a wound low on his belly. Behind him, half buried, was a little girl, her small body folded in on itself, legs drawn up tight beneath a winter coat many sizes too large, a scarf twisted messily at her throat. The man's arm was curved around her, holding her close, his own body arched to shelter her from the wind. No cry for help had escaped his lips, only the mute stubbornness of someone unwilling to surrender what mattered most. Jack leaned close, checking for breath, for the faintest pulse at the man's throat. There, weak, unsteady, but there. He pressed 2 fingers to the girl's wrist, felt a flutter beneath her cold skin. Her lips were blue, her breath a shallow cloud. Jack's hands worked with the practiced slowness of someone who had spent a lifetime at the edge of disaster. He shrugged off his own coat, draping it over the child, gathering her into his arms. She didn't flinch, just burrowed deeper, eyes pressed shut, a small sound escaping from between her lips, not quite a word, more like the sigh of a dream turning cold. The man, barely conscious, shifted his head. Jack reached for his radio, thumbed the button, static crackling in his ear. "Officer needs assistance, Sector 9, South River." The words were snatched away by the storm. He tried again. Nothing. Only a dull, wavering tone, lost in the blizzard's white noise. There was no time for hope, only for motion. Jack hooked an arm beneath the man's shoulder, his own muscles screaming in protest, and began to drag both bodies toward the faint glimmer he'd glimpsed through the trees. A cabin's window, a pale rectangle of gold in the endless blue of night. Each step cost him something. He counted them in silence. The girl pressed close, her breath shallow, her small hands curled against his chest. The man's feet left long, wavering tracks, shoes scraping the crust of ice. Jack couldn't recall when he'd last felt the warmth of another's trust. He moved now for their sake, not his own. The world shrank to the crunch of snow beneath his boots, the rattle of breath, the ache where exhaustion made his vision swim. Sometimes he closed his eyes, moving by instinct alone. He wondered what the girl would remember of this night, the pressure of arms, the hush of a man's heart, the cold that felt endless. Behind him, the wind shifted, stirring the branches, carrying a faint sound. Not quite a voice, not quite an animal, something watching or waiting. He didn't turn to look. He stumbled, knees buckling, but managed to keep both bodies upright. The cabin light seemed closer, then farther, then close again, like a lantern bobbing at sea. His breath grew ragged, each exhale sharp with pain. The man in his arms coughed once, a wet, rattling sound. The girl whimpered, and Jack felt her shudder against him, but she didn't speak. Maybe she had learned already that words were no use in the dark. Snow had begun to fall again, erasing their footprints almost as soon as they made them. The forest pressed in, a silent witness, branches scraping his shoulders, their burden falling on all three. At last, the light ahead stopped flickering. A house, small and weathered, with a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Jack pressed forward, the last of his strength spent on the effort of reaching it, his heart beating louder than the wind. He reached the door and knocked, 3 times, then again, and then waited, head bowed, letting the weight of the child settle against his chest. In that moment, there was nothing to do but stand still and listen to the crackle of frost, the hush of a small life breathing, the ache that settled in the hollow behind every word he'd never said. Inside the house, footsteps moved. A light brightened, the door swung open, spilling warmth onto the snow, and for a moment, the world stopped spinning. Jack did not speak, he simply looked up, his eyes tired, and carried the burden of the night across the threshold. In the kitchen of the cabin, firelight flickered over bare wooden floorboards, and the weathered backs of chairs. The warmth was a living thing, rising from the hearth, curling into corners, filling the air with the scent of burning pine. Outside, the storm pressed close against the small windows, coating the glass with patterns of ice that melted and formed again. Maggie Forrester crouched near the stove, coaxing a blue flame to life beneath a battered kettle. The hush in the cabin was both comfort and habit. She found it easier to move quietly, as though her presence should not startle the air. A mug stood ready, steam rising, her hands wrapped loosely around the clay. Alder, the German shepherd, lay by the front door, his head on his paws, eyes half closed but always aware. Sometimes, in the silence, Maggie imagined she could hear the dog's thoughts, a low thrum of patience, the memory of old commands, the gentle worry of someone who has known loss. A sudden flurry of snow rattled against the door. Alder's ears snapped forward, and Maggie froze, kettle in hand. She waited. The storm sang louder, but beneath its howl came a new sound. 3 heavy knocks, uneven, deliberate. She set the kettle aside, her body already moving toward the hallway. Alder was on his feet before she was, tail held low, moving with purpose. They reached the door together. Maggie hesitated only a second before unlatching the lock. The door creaked wide, letting in a gust of freezing air. For a heartbeat, nothing but the snow, white, swirling, and endless. Then she saw him, a tall man, broad-shouldered beneath a uniform jacket nearly hidden by frost, his eyes gray and worn, his face older than his years. In his arms, a little girl, bundled in a coat too large, her cheeks colorless, lashes dark with melted snow. Draped over his shoulder, nearly limp, was a second man, his breathing shallow, his face the shade of faded paper. Maggie met the stranger's gaze, searching for some signal, but found only exhaustion and the silent plea for shelter. She nodded. No words, no questions, only a gesture of acceptance. Alder stepped aside. Together they lifted the wounded man across the threshold, his boots dragging patterns in the snow. The child's fingers clung to the fabric at Jack's collar, knuckles white, her face buried against his chest. The door closed behind them, and the storm was left outside. Inside, the world contracted to the soft, golden circle of the fire, the hush of breath, and the sudden bustle of hands moving with gentle urgency. Maggie led the way to the main room, clearing a space on the worn sofa with a sweep of her arm. She reached for a blanket draped over the back, tucking it around the man, pressing her palm gently to his forehead, then to the wound at his side. Her hands were steady, trained by years of necessity, by nights in hospitals and afternoons tending neighbors who would not ask for help. Jack set the girl down, his arms trembling from fatigue. She did not open her eyes, but whimpered once, curling in on herself. Alder moved to her side, his nose brushing the air near her face, tail still. Maggie glanced at the dog, a silent understanding passing between them. Alder nudged closer, his presence a quiet reassurance, and lay beside the child, a dark, solid warmth in a world turned too cold. Jack straightened, rolling his shoulders, the weight of the night settling anew. He stood by the door, out of habit more than need, as if he should remain on guard. Maggie busied herself with her kit, unwrapping gauze, inspecting the wound, a gash deep but clean, blood still seeping. She pressed a cloth to the man's side, listening for the change in his breathing. There was pain, but also a kind of surrender. He had held on for so long. Perhaps this place was as close to safe as he could hope. The kettle began to whistle, high and thin. Maggie rose and poured water into a second mug, setting it on the table near Jack. He did not move to take it at first, eyes fixed on the child, as if the act of looking might keep her from slipping away. Eventually, he wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the heat bleed through his gloves. His face was drawn, shadowed by long days without rest. Alder, watchful, pressed his body closer to the girl. He licked a trail of melted snow from her cheek, then rested his chin on her knees, eyes flicking to Maggie as if asking permission. Maggie knelt beside them, brushing a strand of hair from the child's brow, feeling for fever. The girl's skin was cold, but her pulse fluttered, a small, stubborn hope. No one spoke for a long time. The fire snapped, the clock ticked, the wind hammered against the roof. Inside, there was only the work of tending wounds and waiting for breath to steady. Jack moved at last, crouching beside Alder, fingers trailing over the dog's rough fur. He looked at Maggie, just a glance, an unspoken question, and she nodded once. They worked together, stripping off the girl's wet boots, wrapping her feet in a towel, laying another blanket over her shoulders. When the tasks were done, the room settled into quiet. Jack sat with his back to the wall, shoulders hunched, mug cradled in both hands. Maggie perched on the edge of a wooden chair, watching the fire. Alder closed his eyes. The girl curled against his side. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the small house for a few moments, there was peace, thin and fragile as the crust of ice on the window, but holding. No one asked for explanations or offered comfort aloud. There was only the simple, silent welcome of warmth, a roof, and a watchful dog who had learned that sometimes, to heal, one must first be willing to stay. Inside the cabin, time thinned to the shape of lamplight. The blizzard had turned the world outside to blankness, but in the low glow of the hearth, every movement was magnified. The shuffle of Alder's paws on the rug, the soft clink of a teacup being set down, Maggie's measured footsteps from one corner to another as she gathered fresh bandages and boiled water, her motions as practiced and silent as a prayer. The wounded man on the sofa, still a stranger, even as she pressed a cloth to his side, drifted in and out of shallow sleep, lips parting for a name that never arrived. His hand twitched as if reaching for something only he could see. Maggie spoke nothing into the hush, her presence a gentle weight beside him, her touch unhurried. The girl, swaddled in Jack's coat and a wool blanket, had not stirred since coming inside. She lay curled at the far end of the couch, cheeks flushed pale from cold and fever, her chest rising with each fragile breath. Jack sat on a low wooden stool, head bowed, elbows on his knees, the shadows of old fatigue written in every line of his face. His hands, large, weathered, careful, traced a pattern in the grain of the floor, as if reading a story only he knew. Occasionally, he looked up, gaze landing on the girl, then Maggie, then Alder, never resting for long. He seemed always to be measuring something, the angle of light, the drift of snow along the window, the silences that collected like dust in corners. Alder stationed himself between the girl and the outside door, his body still, but his eyes alert, ears cocked at the sound of every crackling log. The dog's presence filled the room in a way no human voice could. At times, he pressed his nose lightly against the girl's hand, breathing in her scent, the faint, vulnerable pulse beneath her skin. When she whimpered in a dream, Alder shifted closer, warmth radiating through the blanket, a silent promise that nothing would approach without passing through him. Maggie moved from the sofa to the kitchen, pausing by the window to peer into the storm. The world beyond was unknowable, just whirls of white and the ghostly skeletons of trees. She drew a circle on the glass, feeling the bite of cold through her fingers. Then she turned back to the fire, setting a kettle to heat, the quiet whistle rising and falling as the wind found seams in the roof. She knelt by the girl, checking her temperature again, brushing damp hair from her brow, fingers gentle and sure. Jack watched, his breathing evening out, his jaw unclenching by small degrees. He had grown used to action, to the grind of adrenaline and aftermath, but here there was only waiting. No sirens, no frantic commands, just the rhythm of healing, slow as thawing ice. The wounded man moaned softly. Maggie leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe. Rest." He settled, though his face remained troubled. Jack watched him, the lines around his own eyes deepening, not with judgment, but something closer to understanding. For all the times he'd tried to carry his own pain in silence, he recognized it now in the faces of strangers. Alder rose and circled the room once, stopping at Jack's knee. He pressed his head against Jack's thigh, waited, then looked up, amber eyes reflecting the fire. Jack's hand hovered before lowering to the dog's head, the weight of it resting there for a moment. It was a small thing, no words, no praise, but Jack felt something in his chest loosen, as if the knot of old guilt had eased. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Maggie poured hot water into a bowl, soaking a fresh cloth. She wrung it out and dabbed the girl's face, her movements steady. The girl's lashes fluttered, her lips parting as if to speak, but only a soft sigh escaped. Maggie smoothed the blanket around her, then sat back on her heels, watching the firelight dance over the walls. Jack cleared his throat. But whatever words he thought to say dissolved in the warmth of the room. It was enough, for now, to be in company. Enough to witness the rise and fall of breath, the slow knitting of skin, the flicker of hope in a child's grasp on a dog's fur. Time drifted. Alder dozed, Maggie cleaned and redressed the wound. Jack checked the radio again, still only static. They passed the hours in shared quiet, each carrying their own stories in the space between heartbeats. Sometimes Jack caught Maggie's eye across the room and nodded, a silent pact of patience. Sometimes Maggie would touch Alder's head as she passed, gratitude in her touch. As night deepened, the storm outside began to fade, the wind falling to a hush, the world beyond the glass settling into a new stillness. Inside, the room held its fragile peace, breath, firelight, the soft weight of sleep. No one spoke of what tomorrow might bring, or of the dangers still lingering in the world outside. In the hush, each person measured their own losses and found, if not comfort, then the brief reprieve of shelter, the knowledge that for one night, in one small house, no one had to bear the storm alone. Night stretched long over the cabin. The storm slackened and drifted east, leaving the world muffled in blue beneath a faint wash of moon. Inside, the warmth held steady. Maggie tended the wounded man through each small hour, changing his dressings, counting out quiet heartbeats, brushing her hand across his brow when pain broke the shallows of sleep. Jack offered help where he could, but more often drifted near the girl and the dog, his presence a steady shape at the edge of lamplight. Sometimes he would move to the window and listen to the silence. It was the kind of quiet that could swallow a man's voice, and Jack found himself grateful for it. He leaned his forehead against the cool pane, watching the dark, and let old worries rise and fall like the distant rhythm of water under ice. He remembered another night, A hospital corridor and fluorescent lights. The look on his wife's face the last time she'd spoken to him. The sting of words they could never take back. Regret was not a story told aloud, but a shadow that returned, year after year, in moments when there was no one left to blame. Behind him, Maggie wrapped a blanket more tightly around the sleeping girl. The child's breathing was steadier now, her body tucked against Alder's side, small hands lost in thick fur. Alder lay motionless, except for an occasional flicker of his ears. But Jack saw the watchfulness beneath the dog's calm, a way of holding space for suffering without trying to fill it. He envied the dog that. Maggie moved with a gentleness that came from practice. Jack watched as she pressed a cup of water to the man's lips, guiding him through swallowing, patient with every hesitation and cough. She wiped sweat from his brow, then sat back in the creaking chair, hands folded, her eyes resting on the fire. For a long while nothing broke the hush but the crackle of sap in the pine logs. At length Maggie spoke, not to the man but to the room. "I used to work night shifts, in the city where sirens are never far. My first year I lost a child." Her voice was even, nearly soft. "A girl about this age. The mother stayed all night beside her bed. I remember the way her hand never stopped moving, rubbing the girl's back, brushing hair off her face, as if every touch could turn the story another way. When it ended, there was nothing left to do but close the curtains, mop the floor, wash my hands, and move on. But I couldn't move on. The fire spit, a thin line of sparks leaping up. Jack watched Maggie's hands, one thumb circling the back of the other, over and over, a silent litany of what could not be changed. "My father told me people think nurses get used to it, but they don't," she continued. "You don't carry loss the same way every time. Sometimes it's heavy, sometimes it's thin, like a scar you rub with your thumb when no one's looking. Sometimes it just waits, quiet, until you hear a child breathing in her sleep and wonder how many more nights she'll have." Jack listened, letting the words settle between them. He thought about how he'd learned to hide his own wounds, how the world expected men like him to keep moving, to shake it off, to bury what hurt beneath the work. He wondered, not for the first time, what it might feel like to set those burdens down, even for a moment. He cleared his throat. "My wife died in an accident," he said, the words scraping out. "We'd argued. I left the house angry. She took the car. There was black ice on the bridge. When I got to the hospital, it was too late. The last thing I said to her was, 'Not something you want to remember. It's been years.' But most nights, I still hear it." Silence pooled between them, not awkward, but deep. Maggie's eyes found his, and in the hush, there was nothing but the fact of being human, of having failed, of having tried, of living on in the aftermath. Alder shifted. The girl murmured in her sleep, and the dog responded with a low, steady hum in his chest. Maggie reached out and laid a hand on Alder's side, her touch light but certain. "Sometimes I think dogs know more about pain than we do. They don't try to fix it or make it small. They just stay." Jack nodded, unsure if he had anything left to add. He watched the way the girl's hand curled around a tuft of Alder's fur, the way Maggie's eyes shone in the firelight. He wondered if healing was always this slow, this quiet, a matter of staying, of not turning away from suffering, no matter how small the gesture seemed. The wounded man groaned, drawing their attention. Maggie was at his side in a moment, wiping his forehead, speaking soft reassurances. Jack fetched another blanket, covering the man's legs, feeling the chill recede in small increments. They moved through the night like this, sharing watch, trading silences, their burdens lightened only by the presence of each other. As dawn threatened at the window, Jack felt something shift, a loosening, a beginning, the first sign that even after the longest night, warmth would return. The first light came not as a golden flood, but as a pale, searching hush that pressed gently through the frost-blurred windows. Night's heavy hold loosened its grip by degrees, the darkness in the cabin retreating to corners, and the fire in the hearth settling to a low, steady ember. In that half-light, the hush of breath and the shuffle of a dog's movement became the only measure of time. Maggie sat beside the sofa, knees drawn up, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She hadn't slept, but rest had found her in the steadiness of her own pulse, the rhythm of caring for others when her own thoughts grew too loud. The kettle on the stove steamed quietly, filling the air with a hint of warmth and the memory of something sweet, a promise of tea, of comfort, of morning. Alder, sprawled on the braided rug, shifted his weight. He lifted his head, ears pricking, muzzle pointed at the sleeping child. For a long moment he watched her, his brown eyes reflecting a depth no one could quite name. The girl's hand had curled into his fur sometime during the night. She lay tucked against him, her face half hidden, her breath a soft cloud that fogged the dog's chest. Maggie watched, too, her own hand hovering near the child's hair but not quite touching. There was something sacred in this pause, this space where nothing more could be done, and all that remained was waiting. Outside, the snow had stopped, the silence now pure and gentle. The world, for once, was not rushing toward crisis. Jack sat near the window, elbows on his knees, head bowed in quiet surrender. He had let his mind wander the terrain of old wounds, and found it, for now, less sharp. He watched the room as if unsure of his place in it, but Alder's tail gave a faint thump on the floor, a small welcome, the kind that didn't ask for words. The girl stirred, first a twitch in her fingers, then the softest sigh, like a thought escaping in sleep. Alder leaned in, the tip of his nose nudging her cheek. Her lashes fluttered, heavy and wet, the barest whisper of color returning to her skin. Slowly, almost fearfully, her eyes opened to the room, a confusion of half-dreams and firelight and unfamiliar faces. For a second she didn't move. Then her gaze found Alder's steady, waiting form, and something in her face shifted, fear subsiding, replaced by a fragile sense of belonging. With a small, shivering motion, she reached both arms around the dog's neck and buried her face in his fur. She clung to him with a silent desperation, as if the world could not touch her so long as she held on. Maggie did not rush to comfort, did not fill the hush with questions. She sat at the child's side, her hand finally settling on the small, trembling back. The warmth of her palm, the solidity of Alder's body, these were anchors in a world that had spun out of control. Tears came then, not in great sobs, but in slow, quiet drops that darkened the dog's coat and left salt on the girl's cheeks. Jack watched from his place by the window, the beginnings of sunlight laying pale lines across his boots. He let out a slow breath, the kind that shakes loose from deep inside. Something gentle took root in his chest. Not hope quite, but the memory of hope. He closed his eyes, holding the image. A girl and a dog, Maggie's hand, the hush that follows pain. The wounded man slept on, his breathing still uncertain, but stronger now. Maggie checked him, careful and quiet, her hands moving with practiced calm. She brought the girl a cup of warm tea, coaxing her to sit upright, to drink, to find herself safe in this small, unfamiliar space. No one asked the girl for her story, not yet. Instead, they spoke in gestures, Alder nudging her hand when she set down the cup, Maggie wrapping another blanket around her shoulders, Jack placing a fresh log on the fire, its crackle a steady promise that morning had truly come. They let the day begin in silence, each person finding comfort in the small rituals of living. Maggie brewed more tea. Alder stretched and wandered the perimeter of the room, nose to the floor as if double-checking for any threat the world might bring. The girl sat near the hearth, knees tucked to her chest, her eyes following Alder's every movement with a new alertness, the line of her shoulders slowly relaxing. Jack moved to the table and poured himself a cup, feeling the steam rise against his face. He caught Maggie's eye, and she nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. The worst had not passed, but for this moment, there was warmth. As the morning advanced, the cabin filled with the ordinary sounds of life, the clatter of mugs, the whisper of breath, the gentle snoring of the wounded man. Outside, the sky was pale blue, branches heavy with snow, the world holding still. Inside, they did not speak of what had happened, or what would come. Instead, they gathered around the small things, a cup, a hand, the warmth of a dog's body, trusting that these, for now, were enough. Sunlight crept slowly across the old cabin floor, not with drama, but with a diffident gentleness, as though it understood that the world inside was still too tender for bright declarations. Maggie opened the door just enough to let in a breath of cold, clean air. The night's storm had spent itself, and what remained outside was a world wrapped in blue-white quiet. The trees bowed with snow, and the river somewhere below, still hidden under drifting mist. Alder was the first to move toward the new day. He stepped outside and pressed his nose to the snow, reading the world as only a dog can, taking inventory of all that had come and gone while the cabin's occupants slept. Maggie watched him from the threshold, the girl's small hand wrapped in hers, both standing in the hush of the porch, their breath rising together in the cold. Inside, Jack stoked the fire and glanced back at the wounded man, now stirring on the sofa. The man's eyes blinked open, blue, watery, disoriented at first, then searching. Jack stepped closer, offering a cup of water, his words unnecessary. The man took a careful sip and let his gaze wander, confusion giving way to memory. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse. "Where?" His question trailed off into the stillness, the cabin answering with silence and warmth. Maggie returned, guiding the girl back to the hearth. She knelt by the sofa, her tone gentle but direct. "You're safe. Rest easy. There's no rush for anything now." The man's hand moved with difficulty, searching for the girl. Maggie helped her climb up beside him, and the two sat close, shoulders touching. She was still too young to understand all that had passed, but she recognized safety in the shape of the room, the smell of breakfast being warmed, the quiet presence of the dog who now lay at her feet. Jack watched them with a kind of awe, the simple persistence of human connection, how it could weather so much and still hold firm. The wounded man met Jack's eyes and nodded once, an offering of trust, the kind men rarely give aloud. Minutes passed. The girl ate quietly, small bites of toast, sips of milk, her gaze never leaving Alder, who lay as always nearby, patient and unmoved by the changing currents of the room. There was something in the dog's bearing that steadied everyone, a groundedness, a reminder that time need not be rushed, that survival itself was a gentle thing, if tended with care. After some time, the man's breathing grew easier. Maggie sat with her notebook, jotting down a list for the next supply run, her handwriting precise and looping. The man glanced at her, then at Jack, and finally at the girl, whose hand now rested on his knee. "My name's Tom," he said, voice still hoarse. "This is my niece, Lily." His words dropped into the silence like pebbles into water, rippling outward, changing nothing and yet everything. Jack nodded, waiting. Tom's gaze drifted to the window, and he seemed to weigh his story for a moment before continuing. "We were on our way back from my sister's. Took the shortcut by the river. Didn't see them coming. A truck, men in it, not from around here. They wanted the car. I tried to keep Lily out of sight. But..." His words faltered, a flush of helplessness on his cheeks. Jack wrote nothing down. There was no need. This was not a morning for official reports. It was a morning for listening, for the kind of patience that never makes a show of itself. Maggie pressed a cup of tea into Tom's hand, her eyes gentle, and waited for him to find his breath. "They left us in the snow," Tom finished. "I tried to keep her warm. Didn't think anyone would find us." Jack nodded again. The ache in his own body seemed to soften in the presence of such simple truth. He didn't offer comfort. There was nothing to say. Alder shifted, stood, and walked over to Tom, pressing his head gently into the man's hand, then nosing Lily's arm until she laughed, a small, broken laugh, but a real one. It seemed enough to break the heaviness of the morning. Outside, the sun had risen higher, turning the surface of the snow to 1,000 glittering mirrors. Maggie made eggs and toast, the mundane act of breakfast a comfort in itself. The girl and her uncle ate slowly, savoring each bite as if learning what safety tasted like. No one spoke of leaving, or of what waited beyond the porch. The world inside the cabin was a separate country, a place where wounds, both old and new, were seen and tended, not hidden away. Jack poured himself a second cup of coffee, letting its heat settle the tired places in him. He met Maggie's eyes and offered the smallest of smiles. She returned it, her face lit by a softness that hadn't been there the night before. By late morning, Lily had curled up beside Alder, her laughter growing stronger, her trust in the world slowly taking root again. Tom dozed, head leaning back, his hand resting on the dog's side. Jack stepped outside for a moment, boots crunching on the porch, and breathed deep the clean, cold air. He let the sun touch his face, the scent of pine and wood smoke filling his lungs, and allowed himself to believe, just a little, that beginnings were still possible. By afternoon, the edge of winter seemed less sharp. Sunlight slanted through the cabin windows, painting wide gold bars across the floor, across Jack's boots and Lily's tangled hair, across the old scars on Alder's flank. The worst of the storm had passed, leaving the air inside light and clear, the hush now gentle instead of heavy. From the porch, Maggie watched the world, her mug cradled in both hands, her breath rising in slow, visible streams. The trees beyond were bowed but unbroken. In the distance, the blue line of the river glinted where the snow had melted back, revealing water still moving beneath its skin of ice. Tom sat up slowly on the couch. Lily curled beside him, her fingers twined in the ruff of Alder's neck. There was a kind of careful peace in their posture, a closeness that needed no words. Tom watched Maggie in the doorway, Jack at the table with the radio, Alder sprawled in the patch of sunlight, and allowed himself to believe that for the first time in days, perhaps in years, he could simply rest. There was work to do, of course, Maggie filled the kettle, wiped down the counter, checked her list again, moving through her small rituals with a steadiness that invited others to breathe more deeply. Jack checked the battery on the radio, caught a crackle of distant signal, then only static. He didn't push. He let the world take its time. In the quiet, the sound of a distant engine wound its way up from the road, a low, steady thrum, rising and falling as it climbed the rutted lane. Jack glanced up, met Maggie's eyes, and in that moment, nothing needed to be said. Alder was already on his feet, his head cocked, tail low but calm. The world was still safe here. The sound was not a threat, but an answer. The ambulance and sheriff's car appeared through the trees, their red and blue lights dulled by daylight, their approach slow, cautious, respectful of the peace around the house. Maggie stepped onto the porch, Jack beside her. No one hurried. No one called out. It was as if the rescue itself recognized the need for gentleness. Tom lifted Lily into his lap, smoothing her hair with a hand still marked by the stiffness of cold and fear. The girl didn't ask questions. She sat quietly, Alder pressed close beside her, her trust in him as absolute as breath. The medics moved with quiet efficiency. Maggie guided them through the small house, her voice low, details given simply. Where Tom was hurt, how long Lily had slept, what Jack had seen by the riverbank. No one asked more than was necessary. The stranger's pain was honored in the way the story was told, in what was left unsaid. A sheriff's deputy in a heavy coat stood quietly in the doorway, hat in hand. He offered a small, tired smile, meeting Jack's eyes, then Maggie's. "You did good," he said. "All of you." He knelt to Lily's level, speaking softly, then let her go. His respect shone more in silence than in words. The girl's gaze never left Alder. As the medics prepared the stretcher, she reached to hug the dog's neck, her arms thin and sure. Alder stood unmoving, letting her sob quietly into his fur, her face hidden from the world. Maggie knelt beside her, one hand on Lily's shoulder, not hurrying her, not urging her away. In the hush, even the paramedics waited. When it was time to go, Tom wrapped a blanket around Lily and carried her to the porch. The sun shone full on the steps, painting the wood with warmth that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He paused, turning to Jack and Maggie, his mouth opening, closing, then settling on a grateful, wordless nod. Sometimes there are no proper farewells. He pressed his cheek to Lily's hair, then carried her down the steps toward the waiting van. At the bottom, Lily twisted in his arms, searching for Alder with her eyes. The dog trotted down, brushing his side against her legs, then sitting and offering a gentle nudge with his nose. For the first time since the storm, Lily smiled, a soft, unsteady smile, bright as the pale sky. She reached out and touched Alder's muzzle, her fingers trembling with something not quite sorrow, not quite hope. The others watched, Maggie's eyes shining, Jack's jaw clenched against some old ache he could not name. The girl did not say goodbye. Instead, she lifted her hand and waved, once, twice, her small fingers open in the sunlight. Alder sat until the ambulance doors closed, and the sound of wheels on gravel faded down the hill. Back on the porch, the quiet settled like a quilt. Jack and Maggie watched the empty lane, Alder standing between them, their shadows drawn long across the steps. The sense of what had been lost lingered, but so did the knowledge that a little girl had found her way home. Not just to a place, but to safety, to kindness, to a world that, however briefly, had held her gently. Inside the cabin, the fire was burning low. Maggie moved to tend it, Alder trailing behind, curling in his place beside the hearth. Jack sat in the silence, feeling the afterglow of rescue, the shape of an absence that was, somehow, a kind of peace. The world outside waited with its own troubles, but for now, the house was still, and nothing was required of anyone except to breathe, to listen, and to let the day go on as slowly as it needed. The house grew still once the medics and the sheriff's car disappeared down the rutted drive, snow muffling the last echo of their passing. Afternoon leaned into evening, and the sunlight waned, painting everything with the faint gold of forgiveness. Maggie lingered at the window, eyes on the horizon, as if she could see beyond the trees and rivers to wherever Tom and Lily's journey might carry them now. But there was no more movement outside, only a slow, peaceful drift of clouds and the hush that follows crisis. Inside, the cabin reclaimed its hush and routine, as if drawing breath after holding it for too long. The quiet was not heavy, not hollow, but rich, a vessel that held what words could not carry. Jack set a kettle on to boil, the faint click of the stove and Alder's claws on the floor marking the only sounds. He moved with deliberate care as if not to startle the calm, as if everything fragile in the room might shatter under sudden movement. Alder circled once, then settled at Jack's feet. The dog's tail tapped softly against the rug, an unconscious rhythm, a heartbeat of belonging. Jack let his hand rest on Alder's head, thumb stroking the rough fur at the base of the dog's ear. It was a simple act, but it felt like something earned. For a while, Jack stood in the center of the kitchen, just breathing, feeling, for the first time in a long while, the absence of urgency. Maggie gathered cups and set out tea, moving through her familiar motions. The fire needed tending, and she knelt beside it, feeding split wood to the embers. The flames responded, alive and steady, throwing gentle shadows across the floor. Jack watched her, his gaze softening as the flames grew. There was no need for conversation. The world had said enough. Silence became the place where comfort lived. Later, they sat together near the warmth, each with their own cup, Alder curled up so that his head rested on Jack's foot, his flank pressed against Maggie's ankle. They did not speak of the night before or the child who had clung to the dog's fur, or the stranger's wound, or the sound of wind against the glass. They spoke, if at all, in the language of small gestures, steam rising, the clink of a spoon, a glance exchanged and held for a moment longer than custom required. Maggie stretched her legs toward the hearth, tucking her hands under her thighs. The light played across her face, catching the faint lines at the corners of her eyes. Marks left not by age but by seeing, by enduring. Jack leaned his head back, letting the fire warm his cheeks, letting the day fall away. The lines of exhaustion eased, the muscle in his jaw loosened. Every so often the fire snapped, Alder stirred, or the kettle sang. Time moved in gentle increments, no longer measured by alarms, emergencies, or the ache of the past, but by the soothing repetition of the ordinary. The storm outside had ended, and the storm within them seemed for a while to quiet as well. Night approached without drama. Maggie rose, fetched a lantern, trimmed its wick, and set it glowing on the table. She glanced at Jack and saw him half smile. A brief, uncertain thing, but real. The world had not righted itself, but it had shifted. Some hurt, some loss was still there. But for now it was not at the center. For now, what filled the room was a kind of grace. Jack stood and crossed to the window, looking out at the darkness. Maggie joined him, the two of them side by side, shoulder to shoulder, their reflections blurring together in the glass. Alder padded over, sat at their feet, and looked up at them with patient eyes. Jack's voice, when it finally came, was almost a whisper. Strange how quiet can feel safe again. Maggie nodded, her lips barely moving. Sometimes that's all we need. They stayed like that a long time, the three of them, watching nothing in particular, letting the memory of fear and fatigue dissolve into something softer. Jack let his hand rest on the back of Maggie's, a small gesture. No promise, no plea, just a presence. She turned her palm to meet his, fingers curling, anchoring him and herself to the moment. In the quiet, Alder sighed and lowered his head between his paws, content. Outside, the wind had stilled. Inside, the hush was the gentle space where people and dogs, battered and tired, could begin again. Tomorrow would come, with its demands and questions, but tonight belonged to the lull, to the earned rest, to the heat of the fire and the rhythm of shared breath. The world was not perfect. Wounds did not vanish. But together, for this small stretch of time, they let themselves be held by the quiet. The kind of quiet that heals, not by erasing what was lost, but by reminding each heart that it is not, in the end, alone. The world turned once more. Morning light returned, almost shyly, washing the cabin in muted silver. It seeped through the frost-edged window panes and stretched in thin lines across the floor, catching on the empty mugs and the soft swirl of dust in the air. The fire had died to embers. The hush of night was not banished but softened, holding a different weight now, the quiet of renewal rather than aftermath. Jack woke first. He sat at the table for a long moment, shoulders rounded, hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee he didn't remember pouring. Through the window, the world was washed clean. Snow still heaped in the hollows, the river shining between ragged ice floes, pine trees glistening in the new sun. He listened. Not for alarms, not for footsteps or raised voices, but for the subtler sounds. Alder's slow breathing, Maggie's measured tread as she moved about the kitchen. Alder rose, stretching his body with an old dog's patience, tail beating a gentle rhythm against the floor. He padded to Jack's side and pressed his head beneath Jack's hand, eyes half-lidded with trust. Jack scratched behind his ears, then let his hand settle, fingers splayed in the thick fur, a sigh, neither happy nor sad, but full, the kind that comes after a night of keeping watch and finding, in the dawn, something left to guard. Maggie joined them, her hair loosely braided, a sweater pulled over her shoulders. She stood in the doorway, looking out at the white yard and the clear sky. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The shape of her presence was enough, a gentle reassurance that life, for all its sharp turns and long silences, was still here, still unfolding. She poured fresh water for Alder, her hands unhurried. Outside, the snow shone brighter as the sun climbed. Jack stood and pulled on his coat, gesturing for Alder to follow. Maggie smiled, a small, private thing. Jack stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching softly. The cold met him with the bite of something honest. Alder trotted ahead, nose to the air, body loose and easy. Together they moved down the familiar path, a line of footprints pressed side by side in the snow. The air was crisp and full of scents. Wood smoke, the faint sweetness of old grass, the sharp tang of river ice. Jack walked slowly, not with the urgent stride of a man chasing trouble, but with the attentive steps of someone learning to notice each small grace. Alder's breath pluming, a bird's call from the thicket, the delicate web of frost along the fence. The dog would pause sometimes, sniffing at a hidden trail, looking back with calm assurance before forging ahead. Behind them, Maggie watched from the porch. She lifted a hand in greeting, sunlight playing across her face. There was something steady in the way she stood there, as if she'd always known how to wait for someone to come home. Jack lifted his hand in return, a gesture more than farewell, less than a promise. There was no talk of the night before, no recounting of wounds or fears. In the gentle pace of morning, words were as unnecessary as apologies. The world was not remade. Their histories had not been rewritten. But the day was open, and the path before them clear. As they walked, Jack found himself breathing more deeply, the cold filling his lungs, the ache in his chest softening. He thought of the little girl's hand wrapped in Alder's fur, of Maggie's voice in the dark, of the way the cabin had held them all, battered but unbroken. He did not name these thoughts. He let them move through him, quiet as sunlight, gentle as the hush that lingered between each step. At the edge of the clearing, Jack knelt, pressing his face close to Alder's, forehead to the dog's warm head. The dog leaned in, still as stone, eyes bright and attentive. Jack whispered something into the fur, words the world would never hear. Then he stood, dusted the snow from his knees, and turned back toward the cabin, Alder at his side. Maggie was waiting, her arms crossed, her face soft with the knowledge of all that had passed. Jack met her gaze and smiled, a simple, grateful smile, neither beginning nor end, but an acknowledgement of survival, of having held on through the storm. Inside, the house was warmed by the fire Maggie had coaxed back to life. The smallness of the room, the ordinariness of their movements, held a peace that didn't require explanation. Jack hung his coat, Alder curled at his feet. Maggie poured tea. The three of them sat together. No words, just the quiet ease of belonging, the gift of a morning given back. No one spoke of miracles. Yet, as the sun rose higher, lighting up the snow and the walls, there was the feeling, unspoken but shared, that sometimes a miracle is simply not turning away when someone needs you. Sometimes it's staying through the night. Sometimes it's silence, sometimes a gentle hand, sometimes the warmth of a dog's breath on your cheek. The day unfolded, slow and sure. The world outside called, but for now they stayed. The hush of winter remained, not as a weight, but as a shelter, holding space for the fragile, persistent hope that the next step, the next dawn, would be enough. Jack reached for Alder, hand steady, heart lighter. He did not need to speak his gratitude. It was there in the touch, in the silence, in the life still here to be lived. Another day had arrived, and with it, the gentle certainty that for all their scars, they had not been left behind. Sometimes the world heals not with noise, but in the hush after a storm, where old wounds grow quiet, and strangers become shelter for one another. In a small cabin beneath a winter sky, a wounded man, a silent child, a steadfast nurse, and a loyal dog found the courage not just to survive, but to stay. They discovered that hope is not the absence of pain, but the quiet choice to remain when walking away would be easier. Perhaps the greatest miracles are born in the patience of small acts, a warm hand, a silent vigil, the trust of an animal who never leaves your side. We all carry scars, and yet, through kindness, through staying, light finds its way back in. If this story touched you, I invite you to share a moment when someone's quiet presence made all the difference. Your story, your voice, could be the hope someone else is waiting for. Thank you for being here, and for believing that even the softest bonds can change a life.